Evening and welcome to the Laugh and Monkey Music Show. Today we have on Steve Albini. How you doing?
Good so far.
Well, people that know music know you, and people that don't know music are going to learn. You really believe in the artist and support the artist, and you kind of what way it should be. You know, one of the things you're known for is speaking out. And I know you don't like making a big deal out of it, how you don't take points on an album or anything. And more people should do it is really what it comes down to. I think that's and people don't know he doesn't take points. He just one cut, one pay, he moves on.
Well, not to cut you off there, but I've always seen my role in any recording session as being more of a facilitator, that is more of an engineer than a producer. In my mind, the producer is the person that's making the decisions during the session, like that is the creative and artistic decisions, the technical decisions, song selection, making editorial choices within the takes and that sort of stuff. That the person that does that is the person I would consider the producer. And in essentially every record I've ever done, that role has been played by the band. So I don't think I don't consider myself a producer, but it's not like it's not a semantic difference. It's just that role, that is the role of making the decisions and calling the shots on the session, I have essentially 100% abdicated to the band that I'm working with at the moment. So but I mean, what I do can have an influence on the session. As an engineer, I'm presenting the band with options and choices that they can choose from. But I'm very much not a producer in the conventional sense, where like I have an idea of how I want this song to sound, and then I bring in all of I rally all my forces and I summon everything into being, and then when we're done, the song sounds the way I want it to sound. That definitely isn't my role. And as far as the money thing is concerned, like me not getting paid a royalty, that just seems normal to me. I mean,
no, I agree with you.
In any other line of work, you get paid for your time.
Mm-hmm.
And that just seems perfectly reasonable. This doesn't seem like a special or magic occupation where that kind of behavior wouldn't be appropriate, So I just do it the same way I would if I was a plumber,
Well, I mean, you're a plumber. You walk by that house there. I plumbed that house. I'm still getting paid for it 3 years later. It does seem like a weird thing, Bands know your sound now and how you work, and you do have a stripped down sound, a very not raw. I mean, it would have to. I hate to put a label on things, but you have a certain sound. It's a very real sound. It's a very live sound. But when you're first starting out, when you're having bands come to you, was there a question of that? How was that presented? Did you kind of just present yourself to them?
Well, when I first started doing it, it was all my friends, like everyone was operating on a shoestring. And so what the job I would do was limited by what I could get my hands on, what equipment I could get my hands on, and my very limited skill set at the time. So, the first time you press record and then hit play and the sound comes out of the speaker, it just seems fucking magical. It seems like you've just accomplished a miracle. And I think I was sort of in awe of that moment for a long time, in the process of learning how to do it. And then things escalated to the point where I was doing semi-professional sessions in the early 80s. But I was still essentially just dealing with my friends. Like the bands that I was recording were all my friends' bands. And so if things fell to pieces, it's not the end of the world. It's, it's not very high pressure. The stakes are not high. Nobody's livelihood dependent on it. We weren't spending much money. So if the whole thing blew up and we had to do it all again, it wasn't the end of the world. I don't think I started feeling my oats, that is like feeling like I was in control. In the beginning, all of my sessions that I was doing were just my friends, like the people that I was around all the time were the people whose sessions I'd be doing. And they were all very crude. It was all limited to what we had on hand in terms of equipment and what I could, what I knew how to operate and that sort of thing. And that carried on for a while. It's a good way to learn because the stakes are low. Nobody's livelihood is on the line. Nobody's career is on the line. You're just trying to document what your friends are doing. And it's a sort of a learning experience for everybody. And you're not investing a lot of money. So if the whole thing blows up and you have to do it all again, it's not the end of the world. Fairly quickly, it escalated to the point where I was doing sort of proper sessions in studios with the same group of people, my friends, just my peer group. And after, I would say it probably took me until about the mid to late 80s, 85, 86, somewhere in there, before I felt like when I was in the studio that I had sort of full command of the capabilities of the studio. And even then, that was a very modest degree of full command. Like over the years, I've learned obviously what I didn't know then. And, now I realize that I've done the majority of my learning since the point where I thought I knew everything. But that influenced me, that got me into a frame of mind where these people have come to me, they want me to help make their record. I am a sympathetic person. We're in this fancy studio. I have all these knobs in front of me. I might as well fucking use all these fucking knobs, And I think there was a brief period there of a few months to maybe a year where I think I was overdoing things, where I was like overcooking all the sounds, like making everything, trying to make every moment on the record special in some way. And in so doing, you make freakish records that don't really represent the aesthetic of the people that you're working with. And I'm glad I got my fingers burned doing that. Like, I'm glad that I went through that experience of sort of overstepping my position and then making bad records and recognizing it and having to turn around and apologize and redo things. And that got me essentially to where I am now in terms of frame of mind, where I'm willing to try whatever anybody else wants to do, but it's rare that I will propose doing something that's sort of, that's radical or experimental on somebody else's record,
You don't like effects much. I know. Where was your mindset? Like, did you have a career mindset? Or were you just going to do everything you wanted to do? Like, it feels like
it never occurred to me that this was a career. Like, it never, not for a single moment while I was in Big Black and making records with my friends on the weekends and doing, other freelance engineering gigs in my spare time. And my band was touring when it could. And, that whole time I had a straight job. I had a 9-to-5 job that I would go to, regularly. Like, that's how I paid the rent. And it just never occurred to me that any of that would become a sustainable existence. I mean, that kind of forced itself on me at a point. In, I want to say 87, my band Big Black did its final recordings and its final tour. I had taken time off from work to go on tour, and I came back from that tour and went back to my job, and that would have been at the end of the summer, and I want to say 87. And I had started to get more and more inquiries about doing freelance engineering work. And I had by that time, I had built a home studio at my house, which is where Big Black did its last bit of recording. And that was becoming a sort of a viable resource for the underground music scene in Chicago. Like, people could come to my house and make a recording, and it would be reasonable quality for almost no money. And so that seemed to be going really well to me. And I realized that with the work that I had on the books, that is with the stuff that I had on my calendar, that I could afford to cover my mortgage and my bills for the next 3 or 4 months. So I thought I would hazard taking a break from my job for 3 or 4 months at a minimum. And if I could make a go of it, I'd keep going. And if not, I could just go back to my job, you know. So I quit my job, but before I quit my job, the people that I was working, the company I was working for, they made several sort of very generous offers, sort of overextending themselves, trying to get me to stay. And they made it clear that if things didn't work out with me on my own as an engineer, that I could go back to this job. Right.
This is the most undangerous story ever. I was
yeah. So it wasn't like a big risk for me. It wasn't like I'm going to shoot the moon and open my studio and pray people come and book it. You know, it wasn't like that at all. It was, I had been gradually building up a freelance clientele as an engineer, largely people that I was sympathetic with and people that I knew either, you know, by name or reputation or in person. So there was a long ramp toward the point where I could quit my job and be an engineer full time. And so when I did that, when I quit my job and I was an engineer full time, I kind of expected it to blow up. Like I kind of expected to run out of work at some point and have to go back to my old job. But it just at the end of every, you know, like every time I looked, I had enough work on the calendar to keep going. And so I just carried on, you know. There was a brief period where I had done a couple of bigger records, bigger meaning like more mainstream record labels, like major label records with a lot of backing on them. And there was a very brief period where I had made a couple of those records and I had some money in the bank. And so I thought, well, if I'm ever going to have a shot at building a proper fancy studio, it's now, you know, like I've got money in the bank. My house is paid for. I can, you know, I can live very cheaply while we build the studio, and I have a kind of a cushion here. So I should just do it, bite the bullet. I should find a building, build a studio, and try to be like a professional, you know? And so that was probably the cutoff point, like at the point where I decided that I was going to invest all of my money, everything I'd ever earned up to that point, and likely anything I ever would earn in my life, that I would just commit all of that to this one project of electrical audio. Like that was where everything sort of came to a point. And that was sometime in 94 was when I committed to finding a building. And I just kept my eye out. And eventually in December of 95, we closed on the building where electrical audio is and started construction in December of 95. And then it took about a year and a half to open there are 2 studios in that building. And it took about a year and a half to build it out to the point where we could open the first studio. During that time, I went broke a couple of times. I ended up selling my house. I, you know, sold all my guitars, sold all my records, all that kind of stuff. But, you know, in the end, I got through it, and then we built the studio, and then the studio has been, you know, my life's work ever since.
And it still is. And I'll put the link for the studio if people are interested to reach out to you for work. You know, that's part of the goal here for this.
Yeah, I mean, the electrical audio has 2 studios, and you know, I work there all the time. When there are sessions for me to do, that's where I am, you know. But there's also a sort of a community of freelance engineers in Chicago that use electrical as a kind of a home base. And then we have a staff of engineers as well that do sessions there in addition to me. So it's not like people have to shell out the big bucks to work with me at Electrical Audio. There are a lot of different ways that you can do a record there.
Well, you also did previous to this studio, you were starting to use other studios too, right? Or you?
Yeah, I have been using other studios just because the studio at my house was extremely modest, you know.
Right.
in the beginning, it was just like a simple 8-track studio,
Like a
suitable
Tascam.
for demos and that kind of stuff, but not a lot else, you know. And then suitable for very simple recording, like 3-piece rock band, no problem. 4-piece rock band, you're kind of pushing it, you know, 5 or more people, and yeah, we're way out of our depth there. So I was using outside studios pretty much all the time as well, like other studios in the Chicago area, and then I would travel to where other people were to do records at
That
their
seems
place.
kind of hard, like almost scary, because every studio is different, kind of like the Millennium Falcon, where like it works differently and it sounds differently. So you're kind of coming in with a new group of people, generally, a brand new studio you've never worked with and don't know the ins and outs of, you know, the sounds and the kinks, and you're just going to do it. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, I mean, part of the job as an engineer is to be able to assess the working environment and figure out what its strengths and weaknesses are, like, quickly, you know. And because I was having to do these very fast sessions, very low budget, very quick sessions, I had developed a number of like shorthand methods of figuring out what parts of the studio were acoustically nice for different things. Like, if you just walk around the studio stomping and clapping and whistling, you can hear the sort of energy of the room everywhere you go. Like, you can hear how much the room is contributing to the sound, and you get an idea like, okay, yeah, this is a nice reverberant or nice reflective area. The drums would sound good in here. Or yeah, this is really close and really dry and really tight. Then, you know, like if you wanted to have a very upfront sort of dry guitar sound, that would be a good spot to put the guitar amp. A lot of it was just that, like, you'd walk around in the studio and try out the different rooms and see what sounded good. Often, I found myself in this position often. The main studio room for recording would be of sort of limited utility, just because it didn't have a particularly lively sound and there wasn't very good isolation. So you know, it was sort of between stools of whether it was a dry isolating room or a loud reverberating live room. So the main studio recording areas in a lot of studios were not that useful. And I often found myself using like an adjoining office area for a live acoustic, or an adjoining entryway or stairwell or something like that. I remember I did a record in Sweden with at a studio called Starrec that had been there for many years. It was built into a barn out in the country in a small town called Vecchio. And there were 2 barns adjoining each other, and there was a big metal roof covering both of them. The studio is in one, and the next barn over was where all the local farmers parked their tractors to keep them out of the weather, right? Mm-hmm. And we were working in the springtime, so the tractors were out, so that second barn room was empty all day. And in the end, we ended up recording the drums in this barn next door to the proper studio, because the studio environment was too dry and too dead sounding. So we moved the drummer into this barn next door to the studio in order to make use of that large live open room. And I found myself in that scenario a lot. I worked at a studio in Toronto, in a suburb of Toronto called Mississauga. And it was the studio that was owned by the Canadian hard rock trio Triumph.
Ooh, line.
Yeah, called Metalworks, I think, or Metal Zone, Metalworks, something like that. And the main studio area was quite small and quite dry, but just beyond the wall, just beyond the back door of that studio area was a storage area, a big warehouse storage area where all of Triumph's touring equipment was kept, all of their, you know, stage equipment, all their lighting, all their, you know, the wardrobes with all their stage outfits and stuff, which, let me tell you, was a lot of fun to dig around in. But more importantly, it had a nice big open acoustic. And so we ended up recording the drum kit in that warehouse area rather than in the studio area, just because the acoustics were more flattering in that warehouse area.
Now, I assume you took that design, all of your, almost like it's guerrilla training is what this has all been for you, now to your own studio.
Yeah.
How much of that did you incorporate in the build? Because you had a shell, you could just build what you wanted. You knew what you wanted, what you didn't want from, you know, this boots on the ground, working malleable.
Yeah, a lot of the lessons that I learned by having to sort of make do in other studios informed all the design choices at Electrical, like things like the sight lines, being able to see from one room to the other. And then just the general character of the studio, like having some reflected energy in the rooms rather than having the rooms be completely dead or dry. Like we have rooms that are dead and dry, but they're dead and dry intentionally. And it's not just was not just a way of sort of covering up a bad design of a room. And then the other rooms are more lively and more reflective, and those actually give you a nice ambient character that you can make use of in the recording. Those are things that were plans going, when we drew it out on a piece of paper. It was like, okay, well, this room is going to be super dead. This one's going to be small and bright. This one's going to be big and boomy. And it just worked out that way. It worked out quite nicely based on what my expectations were, having been in a bunch of other studios.
You have a great drum sound. It's a very full live sound. Do you have that like perfected in a way, like we kind of know we can come in? Because some people are known as, to kind of be there like meticulously days getting the drums right. And some people are just, what they want. They can kind of pop them in an hour or two.
I mean, a lot of it depends on the band and the drummer. Like if the drummer can articulate to me what his ideal drum sound is, like, oh yeah, there's this, I'm really crazy about the drums on this one record. And then, if I know that record and the sound of that record, then I have a direction to go as far as the engineering choices are concerned. I do pride myself on being efficient in the studio, but a lot of that has to do with just time on task. Like I've just done it a shit million times.
Right.
And so I'm not surprised by things, or I'm not wondering what I'm supposed to do in certain situations, I do have a kind of a regular routine for when I get started with a drum kit. Like I talk to the drummer and ask them what kind of sounds they like and don't like. I have them play around on the drum kit and point out any things that they're not happy with or any things that they want to change. And we try to get the drums acoustically sounding toot sweet. Like before I worry about the microphones, the drummer needs to be stoked about the way his drum kit sounds just acoustically. In some cases that it can be something very simple, like, oh, you're playing these very thick, very dead, very used heads. Let's put more lively, brand new drum heads on your drums. And that wakes the whole drum kit up and that solves all the problems. Like it can be something as simple as that. Or, I have a bass drum. The sound man cut a hole in my bass drum, but normally I play with the full front head, but I haven't changed the head out since the sound man cut a hole in it. So, okay, well, we'll just put a new head on there and it should be fine. Or just through sort of received wisdom, things like stuffing the bass drum full of things to deaden the sound of the bass drum can be useful in an onstage setting when you're trying to minimize feedback.
Right.
But if what you're going for is a booming, open, resonant bass drum sound, well, then you don't want to have a bunch of fucking blankets in it, and those kinds of things. It's just a matter of, I mean, it's a learning process on my part. Like I have to talk to the drummer and find out what they want to do, what they want their drums to sound like, and then make whatever material changes you need to in the drums to get the drums sounding the way they're supposed to. Often the drummer will have been working on his drum sound his whole life, and he will be very, very finely tuned to what his drums are supposed to sound like, and he will be ecstatic with his drums as they are. And that's when things are the easiest for me, because then I really don't have to do that much work.
Because to me, drums make or break an album. So I always can really appreciate somebody gets a good drum sound, because that's a good song, with that drum just kills me. It's like flap. It's just not, it's painful sometimes. And it's
it's weird when I hear other people's recordings. I always assume that the sound that I'm hearing is a conscious decision. So even if it's something that I hear that is not flattering in my mind, it doesn't doesn't sound like it's flattering the music for whatever reason, I always assume that there was a reason for it, that there was a conscious decision for that. And I try not to be critical of other people's recordings, just because when I hear other people's recordings, as often as not, there's something that kind of puzzles me. Like, I don't know why that sounds like that. And I don't know what I would do to manifest such a sound. Like if someone said, this is what we want it to sound like, and played me that as an example, in some cases, I would just scratch my head because I wouldn't know how they did it, and so what I've done is I've started, because most of the records that I do, I start at the beginning and I go all the way through to the end. Like I start with the basic tracking and go through all the overdubbing and mix everything. There's a kind of a through line of continuity where at the beginning of the session, you kind of get a read from everybody about what they want it to sound like. And over the course of the session, you're sort of incrementally getting all of the sounds dialed in. And then by the end of the session, everything is sounding precisely the way they've always wanted it to. And then when it comes to the mixing stage, you have this kind of sense memory, like, oh, everybody got turned on when I opened this microphone. So I'm going to lead with that on this next song or whatever. So you have there's a continuity from the beginning of the session until the end of the session that keeps you in the frame of mind of sort of being present for the decisions that everyone is making in real time. I'm distinguishing that from me having an aesthetic about what I want things to sound like, and then tapping them into place until they fit this aesthetic, versus me over the course of time, over the course of a session, learning what the band's aesthetic is and gradually fitting everything in to the point where they're happy with the way everything sounds.
I think the two things most known, well, for me, I would say of you would be, you honor the band's sound the most. And I just heard this from a friend of yours, a lead singer from a Naked Ray Gun. You're just doing some recording of his. I was talking to you the other day. He likes the effects on the voice and he likes it more like the sounds, and you don't. And that is something you just don't like. I'm saying that's one of your things where you just it's never been your thing.
Well, it's not that anything can work in.
He was good too. Don't get me wrong. He loves you. I'm just talking
anything can sound good or bad given the context. Like if you're listening to a very naturalistic recording, and then there's one element that's alien and spacey and weird and very processed, that can either distract you and take you out of this sort of sense of unity that you were getting, or this sort of continuity that you were getting of the sound. It can remove you from that, and that can be bad, or it can highlight this one sound as being this special alien weird sound and sort of center your attention on it. So I can't, in a sort of blanket way, say that abstracting sounds and using effects and things like that, that's bad or good. What I can say is that if you start from a position of abstraction, that is, if all of your decisions are predicated on things being processed and affected and weird and spacey and alien and non-realistic, that if that is your starting point, then it's very difficult to get back to a situation where it sounds naturalistic and real. If you start from a position of naturalism or realism, if you start by trying to make things represent the experience of them in the world, then it's relatively easy to abstract them from there. And sometimes it happens accidentally or incidentally, just like, a good example would be if someone is doing a take and they like lean into the microphone and get really loud for a bar in a take where you don't expect it. You can distort the vocal unintentionally there in that spot. And there are times where when that happens, that's the best part. And so if you leave it in, technically it's an engineering error, but you would leave that in because it added a nice emphasis or something. And then there are other times where people say, well, I like it when my voice is really distorted. I like the sound of my voice distorted as a sound, like a guitar player would like their guitar distorted, you know, as a sound. And so then you have a starting point, like, okay, well, let's set it up so that you can hear various kinds of distortion and you can choose what you like. And then we can proceed from there with you, you know, making a conscious decision for this sound, this abstraction, rather than it being some external thing that I apply to amuse myself in the mixing room, you know.
I thought it was pretty neat because when he mentioned you guys, that was pretty cool. And I asked, since you guys had known each other early on, he actually played briefly in Big Black, right?
Yeah.
What it was like, the difference, the two younger yous doing music, right? To like, and then the age getting together with coming back together and doing music again with the knowledge, like what the difference was, like, you know what I mean?
Well, in my experience, the things that you recognize as the core personality elements of somebody, you know, provided you're talking to somebody who's sentient, you know, somebody who's an adult to a degree, like you can come back in 20 years and that part of them is still there, you know, like the things that you liked about somebody when he was a teenager, those things that made him seem like a good friend and that made him seem like a smart person and perceptive, when you come back to him and he's in his maturity, those things are still there, you know. There was a documentary film that was made maybe 10, 15 years ago about the Chicago punk scene called You Weren't There. And it had a bunch of interview footage of people, you know, 25 years later, reminiscing and talking about their frame of mind when they were young and what the punk scene was like when they were teenagers or whatever. And these are all people that I knew intimately. Like these are all people that I spent all my time with. These are the people that helped form me as a person, and the people that I played in bands with, and people whose bands I went to go see. And, you know, I went to the parties at their house. I walked them home drunk, you know, like these are like people that I knew intimately. Right.
Yeah.
And those people, when they were young people, had a spark that invigorated me, and that was contagious and made me want to get involved in music and made me want to do all of these things as well, right? And then those same people being interviewed in their 40s and 50s, talking about what inspired them then, it's the same people, you know. Like if somebody had a petty beef, that petty beef is still there. If somebody, you know, if somebody was like,
that's funny though, you know.
Yeah, if there was like some jealousy or some insult that somebody felt back then, they brought it with them. That's still there. It's baked into their personality, you know. And it was really great seeing all of these people that were so inspirational to me when I was a young person. Like they seemed so wise and they seemed so smart and energetic and so insightful. And then seeing them as adults and realizing, yeah, they were smart and energetic and insightful and creative. There's something amazing about these people. And that's what I recognized when I first encountered them, was I recognized the amazing part. Now there's a mundane sort of everyday part of everybody as well. And the mundane and everyday part of everybody is, you know, that's the part that pays the bills. And I'm no shade on anybody for getting boring as they get old and start to have more responsibilities in their lives. But I thought it was amazing that the same people I had the same emotional reaction, the same intellectual sort of communion with these people, some of whom I hadn't spoken to in 20, 25 years. But there they were, same old guy, exactly the same as I remembered. You know, that was a pretty great experience for me. I'm not a nostalgic person by nature. Like I don't think about the past very often. I appreciate that going through the past is how I got to where I am now, and that those experiences shaped my mindset and formed me as a person. But I don't dwell on it. I don't think there's any value in looking back rather than being active in the moment, right? So it was a brief trip in that sort of direction for me to experience all of these old emotions and all these reactions to these people. It was very nice. And a lot of those same people just stayed smart and inspirational their whole lives. So I don't think that people really change that much. Little aspects of their behavior can change, or elements of their frame of mind, like their orientation on certain things can change. But the tools with which they are building their personality, the tools and materials are the same. It's going to be the same person to an extent.
Well, because I know, like, I also sometimes being a producer, and I could be wrong, but just you also have to play, depending on who the producer is, what you're doing, is not a psychologist, but you do have to read the room. You do have to have some skills to talk to people, unless or they know who they're going into. They know who you are. Some producers, they know who you are, and that's it. And some producers go into all situations and they have to fill out the room, and they become a chameleon. It's different for everybody.
Yeah, I have to say, I don't have the best bedside manner. Like, I don't do a lot of I'm not
boys.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not I don't do a lot of, like, sort of encouraging or coaching or like pep talks, that kind of thing. Like, I'm not. There are other people that I've seen who do that, and who do it in a way where it doesn't seem phony and it doesn't seem like they're glad handing. They genuinely sort of join the band for the duration of the session. And they, like my friend Ian Burgess, who was a great mentor of mine and a real inspiration to me. Like, he was very much like that. Like, when he was in the studio with the band, he was the biggest fan of that band, and he was so into what they were doing, and he wanted, he had essentially joined the band for the duration of the session. And he was the perfect audience for their music. He was the perfect collaborator within the band. Like, he would, I bounce ideas off of them, and they would bounce ideas off of him. And his bedside manner put everybody at ease and made everybody feel like he had the session in his hands. He could be blind drunk and barely able to find his shoes, and still be able to pull everything off and make everybody feel like they were the most important person in the room. Like, I just don't have that in me. I don't have whatever the sociability gene, or the gene that is sort of like performative coaching and encouraging. I'm not good at that.
Do you think it affects sometimes? Like, because the cheerleading and being there can sometimes push an artist out. And I know, let's face it, a lot of artists are insecure, especially singing in the studio. Yeah. It's a different thing there. They're not the rock star. It's different when you're singing dry in a studio.
I think if anything, what I do is I make it clear that people are in control of their session. Like, if they want if they want a certain mood set, like if they want the lights dimmed, or if they want, if they want their special drink, singing tea or whatever, they get all of those things. They can have anything that they want. I make it clear that people can call their shots in the studio. Like, if they want to empty the room so that there's nobody in there but them doing their vocals, that's fine with me. I'm happy to do that.
Well, it's your version of being a cheerleader. You're setting up them for success on their way.
It's basically like giving people license to do things the way they want to. What I'm bad at is, like, sort of coaching and picking takes and there's the legend of various producers who make people do hundreds of takes of a vocal until the person is just like a withered husk and there's nothing left, but then, that 109th take, that's the one that made the record, like, I just don't have that in me. I just can't do it, like.
How many do you do? How many takes you use? A couple? I mean, I don't really heard it.
If you start at the beginning and get all the way through, and if it sounds good to you, then I'm fine with it. Like, I'm not that picky.
Well, I know. I just heard somebody as a producer. I'm sorry. He does destructive recording. I can't think who it is now. Somebody we would all know. He does one track, and then if they want to do it again, he records it over. He wipes it out. They go, "Well, how did you keep it? That could have been the best one." Nope. Gonna do it again. And then we get the best one. We're done. One track recording. That's pretty
Yeah,
aggressive.
I don't have a philosophy about that. Like from a practical standpoint, when you're doing things on an analog session, you have limited tape tracks to work with, so you don't keep redundant material. Like you don't keep things that you're not using. But if someone says, yeah, that could have been the one, keep that and I'll try another one, I'm happy to keep that and try another one. But at some point there'll be a few for them to choose from, and then they have to make an editorial decision and we move on from there. I don't have a single method for doing it, but
Mhm.
I do try to make it clear that whoever I'm recording at the moment, that they're in charge, that they get to have things done their way.
Okay. I have a couple questions. I want to end your microphones, but some of the bands you did, and you recorded, but it never came out with Fugazi album. Can you share like what happened? Why they didn't stick with you? I mean, I would love to hear that.
Yeah, there's a podcast called Fugazi to Fugazi. No, it's called Alphabetic Fugazi, I think it is.
Mhm.
But they went from A to Z through all of their songs, and
I'll have to check it out.
interviewed. It's an interesting podcast where they would
That's awesome.
play the song of interest and interview somebody about the song, their relationship to the song, what they did working on that song, various members of the band, various people close to the band, whatever. And they interviewed me about this session that I did with Fugazi. And the way it worked out was they were fixing to record an album that became In on the Kill Taker. They had some of the songs written and arranged and ready to go, and they were still working on another batch of songs. And they called me and said, yeah, we've known you for a while. We've never worked with you. Why don't we do a session where we record some demos for this record and see how it goes? And I was like, that's a great idea. You should totally fucking do that. So they carried on working and then came out to record. And in the interim, they had sort of finished arranging the rest of the album. So in our initial conversations, it was going to be, let's record a few songs or a few demos anyway, and see how it goes. But by the time they got to my house to do recording, this was when I was still recording at the studio in my house, it was like, well, we have the whole album ready, let's knock it out. And we got along very well, and we were enjoying the sessions, and things were sounding good on initial listen. So we just pressed on, and then they finished recording the album, and we had another day or two. So we just carried on and we mixed it. And then by the time they were finished, I thought we'd done an album, But when they listened to it on reflection back home, they were not happy with the sound quality. They were not happy with the way it sounded. And that's perfectly understandable. They had done essentially all of their recording had been done with very familiar people in very familiar environments.
Right.
And this was the first time they'd gone someplace else to do a session with somebody that they'd never worked with before.
Right.
And so there's any number of things that in play there, whatever. Some days you eat the bear, some days the bear eats you. And it just didn't come out that great. And so essentially they redid the whole album in their sort of original working method, like at Inner Ear with Don or whatever.
Yeah.
And it ended up being a great record,
No, it's Fugazi, so.
And whatever disappointment I felt at not having done a good enough job, like not having cut the mustard with Fugazi, whatever disappointment I felt about that, it's kind of offset by the fact that we remained very good friends. We've done, touring and a bunch of other bullshit together. We've remained good friends, and I'm proud of my friendship and association with them. It doesn't really matter that I never did an album with them,
Well, it doesn't even reflect upon me. I don't think as much as sometimes there's a certain sound the band wants. But I imagine that happens a lot, and that kind of ties in well with a lot of bands. They hear it, they love it when they're excited, but when they go back and they get the other people in their ears, not Fugazi, but anybody, and they're away from you in a situation, and they got the doubts and everything kind of comes in.
It's normal to second guess yourself. like when you finish a record and you listen to it, it's normal to second guess your decisions along the way and wonder if, man, maybe I should have done that one over, or, the mix on that one isn't quite right. Like that's all of that's totally normal. In some cases, there are practical demands. That's like, well, yeah, we have to turn the master in by Friday, so we're not going to be able to redo that, or we're just going to cut that song or whatever. And in some cases, people have the luxury of time and the budget to redo things, and so they redo them. I did a record with a band called McCluskey. I did the first session that I did with them was an album that came out. Everything went great. They did some touring, wrote a bunch of new songs, came over to record another album. But within the band, there had been sort of serious tensions developing, and the band kind of broke up during the recording of that record. So we did get all the way through it, but then they scrapped it, and the band sort of reorganized with a new drummer and came back 6 months later and did the whole thing again, and to great effect. Like,
right.
If they had just put out that record, out of some feeling of obligation, they wouldn't have been happy with it. It wouldn't have been, the experience of doing it was miserable for them, apparently. I mean, they kept a brave face, but apparently they hated the whole social interact, like the interpersonal aspect of it was not great. And I'm glad that they ditched it and came back and did it again. I'm glad that Fugazi ditched the session that we did and went off and made it on Kill Taker on their own. I mean, that record came out great,
Yeah. Well, I imagine, with the industry going up and down, up and down. One of the things, the other question I have is, so at one point, obviously you did Nirvana, but Nirvana liked you because they liked the Breeders, and they liked the awesome Pixie album that you did, which has one of my daughter's favorite songs on that she plays. But so they had a sound they wanted, and they came in and you did your magic and they loved it. But same thing, even as big as they are, when they went out, changes in the sound and doubting and everything else. So move forward from that, though. I mean, that's the story you've talked about. You've come forward, though. You've gone back and you've done some mixes and you've done some more work on their stuff now. How did you end up back with them if the powers that be kind of wanted to make it more pop sensibilities? And how'd you get back in the picture again?
Well, I think, there was a sort of an anniversary edition of In Utero being prepared in 2013. That was like the 20th anniversary edition of the record. And they wanted to make it into a very special package. The most special thing about it to me is that the record label allowed them to do a very careful, comprehensive, all analog master from the original master tapes, direct into metal. And that version of the record, that version of the vinyl record, the double 12-inch 45, which was cut from the original master tapes, direct into metal, full DMM processing, yada yada. That's as good as you can make a phonograph record. Like, you can't do anything more to ensure quality in manufacture, to get a better transcription, like a better transfer at the mastering stage. Like, they did everything right, and I think that was totally worthwhile. In addition to that, they wanted to generate some additional material so that people who were already intimate with this record could have another experience with it. And so they did a series of remixes from the original session where various conscious decisions were made that made a different version of each of the songs. Like, all right, this song was originally recorded with 2 guitars, but one of the guitars was a little out of tune, so we didn't use it. What does it sound like if we go ahead and stick it on there? This song was recorded with a cello part all the way through it, but it seemed kind of cluttered. So let's get the cello out of there so we can just hear the 3-piece band for a while and then have the cello show up as like a little decoration here and there rather than all the way through it. That kind of thing. Like they made conscious decisions on each song that would make a different version, make a version that presented a different aspect of the music. And that came about because Chris Novoselic had bought a surround sound version, a surround sound reissue of a Doors album, an album that he was intimately familiar with since he was a teenager. And when he was listening to the surround sound version, he heard elements in the original recording that he completely overlooked, like things that he'd never noticed before. And he liked having that experience of like, I'm listening to a familiar song,
falling in love again,
but I'm having a new experience with it because it's revealing something different to me.
Yeah.
So that was the impetus toward doing a new mix of the record in 2013. It wasn't like, okay, let's correct the 1993 version.
No, I didn't think that at all. I just thought it was kind of cool they brought you back in it, and I didn't know the process of it. Who would the ultimate say on it?
They had me work on it because I worked on the original sessions and I would be most familiar with it.
Right, but that doesn't always make sense in the record industry. That they make decisions. Who was making the decisions on that? The final decisions on your mixes? Was it Dave and Chris and?
Yeah, it was the band. Like that. I mean,
Pat.
I think there were several things in play there. Like that record, when they made that record in 1993, they were younger people working with older people in positions of authority in the record business. 20 years later, they are now the senior partners in that relationship. You know, they have proved their worth, and that record had stood the test of time. So they were able to say, no, actually, this is the way we want to do it. And then that's the way it got done.
Good.
So, it was the surviving members, Chris and Dave and, and Pat. Pat was there from the beginning of the mixing session, and then he and Dave had to split. So Chris Novoselic and I carried on doing the mixing, and we would send them reference material by uploading mix copies and stuff like that for them to listen to. So they stayed involved the whole time, but they were only physically there for the first couple of days. That's
kind of cool. They were involved and you were back in it. It really honors it, the project, and it kind of keeps it true to what it was.
I also think we had a good working relationship. We got along well. You know, I liked them, they liked me. We respected each other. We've remained friends. You know, I think all of it was just like the easiest solution for it. You know,
the last thing I want to talk about is the effect and the lasting effect. And you're not into looking back. Big Black. I mean, that's quite a big band for some people. You know, a very cool band, cult band. I don't know the best way to put it, but you know, everyone has a good Big Black, the song they love or the album, or you know.
Yeah, I mean, that was sort of me getting my sea legs as a musician, like learning how to play guitar, learning how to write songs, learning how to make records, learning how to interact with the rest of the world as a musician, like, you know, how to book shows, how to play a concert, how to get along with other bands, how to, you know, like.
It was a short process, all right, the band. It was very short. The process, the length of the band's life was like 5 or 6 years. It was short. It was like the Beatles was really short. I had everything was packed into a couple of years.
The first demo recordings would have been in like 1981, 82. And then it was all over by 1987. So yeah, 5-6 years.
Put a lot in there though.
that was, you know, that's a long enough time for you to learn how to do everything, basically. Like I went from knowing nothing, like literally nothing about recording or music or playing in a band. Like I had played in bands, goof off bands when I was in high school, but we'd only ever done a few informal shows. We'd never done any touring or any proper shows really. And then insinuating myself into the music scene in Chicago to the extent where my band was playing every couple of weeks. And we were rehearsing all the time, and we were hanging out with all these other musicians, and I was seeing shows every night of the week. And I was participating in the scene on a number of levels. Like I was doing artwork for other bands. I was doing posters and flyers for shows and clubs. And I was promoting shows as a promoter, and I briefly ran a record label, and I was writing for fanzines and doing, like, I was doing all of this stuff because all of it seemed like it was part of one big continuum. You know, it didn't seem like you needed to be a specialist at the time. It seemed like everybody was going to be doing everything from then on. And that's, you know, that's part of what formed my personality. And it makes me feel like I'm not, if something comes up, a new project comes up that I have to try, something I've never done before, I'm not that intimidated by it. I feel like you can teach yourself how to do whatever it is and just do it. You know, you don't need professionals. And I've sort of carried on that way through my whole life.
Well, first off, I want to thank you for giving some time and talking tonight and sharing some of these stories. I want to tell everybody to check out your website. The link will be below. Check you out if they want to do some recording. Any last advice you give new people that are recording from home, or anything, any little, like an older version of you would tell a younger version of you, you know, about music?
Well, the younger version of me wouldn't have listened, so it doesn't matter. But the thing that's, I think, is really cool now about people working on stuff at home is that, like, you can get reasonably good results pretty simply now. You know, like, when I in the 70s and 80s, when I first started playing in bands, like, you couldn't buy a studio quality microphone at a guitar store. You know, you'd have to have some special connection somewhere and order something from a catalog or whatever, and spend you know, your life savings to get a reasonable quality studio microphone. And now they sell microphones at Guitar Center that are perfectly suitable, perfectly useful for studio recordings, right? In the 70s and 80s, when I started playing in bands, the simplest recording setup you could get would be some kind of a big, cumbersome fucking reel-to-reel 4-track, and you'd need a mixer and a bunch of cables and a bunch of crazy shit to get it going. So it was super cumbersome. Like, no one recorded themselves. It was just way too much work, right? But now, like, you can get an interface and a couple of microphones and plug them into your computer, and anybody with a laptop has some kind of recording medium, which I think is amazing. You know, I think that's an incredible development. And it means that everybody now gets a chance to experience that sort of spooky magic of recording something and then hearing it played back, you know? So I think that's great. I'm super into that as a democratizing element to the way music has evolved. I think that's great. My advice would be to take what you're doing seriously. Like, a lot of people get in a frame of mind where, like, the band will play the song and they'll listen to it and there'll be something that's unsatisfying about it. So they'll immediately start manipulating it, or start overdubbing on it, or start distorting it, or start putting effects on it, or trying to do things to it after it's been recorded. And my advice would be to leave things alone a little bit more. Like, appreciate, like, if your band is kind of sloppy in certain elements, appreciate that as a stylistic element. Or if it bothers you, I guess you could practice and work on it to try to iron it out. But the thing where everybody is sort of nudging their material toward a single sort of professional quality, I think kind of irons out a lot of the personality of bands. Like, you know, there's a 3-piece band, but when you hear their recordings, there's like 9 layers of guitar and 16 layers of vocal. And if I really wanted to hear that 3-piece band, I wouldn't be able to. Like, you can't even hear what the band is like through their recording. And some of that comes from a defensive mindset. Like, well, just one of these can't be enough. Let's put a bunch on there. Let's overwhelm it, you know, and that'll make it special somehow. But the problem is that when you make everything special, then you can't tell when the special part happens. And my advice would be to keep things as simple and as Spartan as you can, at least in the beginning, so that you can hear what you actually sound like, so that you can appreciate, you know, it's like just have an espresso, you know? You don't need a caramel macchiato with whipped cream and cinnamon
These
sprinkles.
are great
on it.
Mm-hmm.
words. This is what I heard when I went to recording school. My teacher said the same thing. First day, he said to us, keep it simple. You can always build from there. You can't go back and change crazy stuff. Start at the beginning slowly.
Yeah. And you know, there's a lot of complexity to an espresso. Like an espresso is not a simple thing, but if you've buried it in caramel and whipped cream and soy milk, like it's going to be more difficult for you to tell what you're working with as a basic espresso. You know?
That's
it.
Advice. That's good advice. Well, I want to thank you for being on the show. It's been my
Well, thanks for
pleasure.
having me.
Thank you.